Risu did an amazing job covering the top 16 decks from last weekend's CoreTCG regionals, the first of 2024 here in North America. But while you get a small snapshot of data from the top 16, what did the entire weekend look like? Strap yourself in, because I went through all 343 deck profiles that were submitted to provide a bigger and broader picture. This video will be organized in a way that talks about every piece of the pie chart before ending with individuals whose deck profiles were the most unique, lumped into the other category. In total, there were over 31 broad categories that I could lump decks into. For example, if there were purple and blue Metal Garurumon players, I simply lumped them under Melga. And with Greymon players, I lumped all the OTK, Toolbox, War Greymon, and Black War variants all together. For the first category of decks, Leviamon X took home the most number of players bringing it to this regional. Out of 343 entries, 41 players, or about 12% of players, decided that Leviamon X would be the choice. Considering many players are on Numemon and Fenrir-Lugamon, Leviamon is a natural counter to both of these decks with how they play bodies by card effects. Numemon, on the other hand, does have a better outlet of floating their bodies, should the one on board be deleted. Overall, although Leviamon only represented 12% of the player pool, it managed to nab 4 slots of the top 16. Coming in second for overall most played deck was interesting: Fenrir-Lugamon. Despite representing another 10% of the player population, only a single Fenrir-Lugamon made it into the top 16. But with so many Leviamon X's, I feel that if you're a Fenrir-Lugamon player and you combo off, Leviamon eats everything up. I know some lists are running a delicate plan, but this stops the activation of Biting Crush and Security, but not if it's already waiting for the Digimon to be played by effect to delay. Of course, interestingly enough, the third most represented deck was Red Hybrid with 26 players, or roughly 7.5%. This deck has an amazing matchup in a majority of the decks at the top. Security Control? Aggressively swing away with Aldomon's Inheritable. Digimon played by effects? Forget about it! The only downside to this deck is that once you lay those 5 security down, that's it. You better hope that there are tamers in there, because when you have to play your tamers or try to proc them off of your Digimon's deletion effect, it feels a little bad. Luckily, Matt Vang was able to navigate a lot of the options that presented themselves in the final match against Tessero, and luckily hit a 7th Lightning instead of a Biting Crush. But the last main heavy hitter that was represented heavily in Core's top 16 is Numemon. This deck took the same number of slots as Leviamon X, and because of its ability to float additional bodies after deletion, it does not care if your opponent deletes your Digimon, or if it's deleted by battle or card effect. These 4 decks represented a third of the players for this event, but the remainder was largely players who wanted to either A, play a new deck that had been just released, or B, play an oldie, but a goodie. Yellow Vaccine decks would be loosely categorized decks that had Patamon at 4 copies in it. Honestly, if I subdivided these decks by their top end, I might actually have another 20 categories. But with the inclusions of Angewomon Ace and Revelation of Light that weren't consistently topping in Japan's meta, here in North America's new BT15 format, there is some breathing room. This deck would squeeze into the top 16, represented by 1 player. My personal favorite play was seeing a Metal Greymon raid into a Godomon only to run smack dab into Angewomon Ace and KO the stack, setting back the Greymon player to just playing a tamer and calling it a turn. The next most played deck would end up being Mega Gargomon with bunnies and puppies, since Terriermon is actually a puppy. I digress though, because this deck was all over the place when it came to checking out tables. While Mega Gargomon Ace can be a menace, unfortunately I do think that this deck still has a lot of problems closing out games. And with Leviamon X being removal, unless your Rapidmon is protecting you still, there's not a lot of other protection for the deck. Mirage and Melga were very close in terms of numbers being played. Both are OTK related strategies that can unsuspend numerous times in a turn. But while Mirage Galgamon did see one fight its way into the top 16, surprisingly, Melga was not seen at all. My theory why Melga wasn't as present at the top could be because of how it could have been matched up. After all, Security Control and Armor were the next most represented decks, which can put a damper on their multiple swing strategy. Armor of course falls in line with Magnamon X, meaning if you are able to climb into this Digimon with an armor Digimon underneath, you have an infinite number of redirects. Low stat line Digimon like Weregarurumon can't compete against this, which is where some of the initial attacks come from. And now with a blue-black Magnamon, you have the opportunity to even de-digivolve your opponent and digivolve simultaneously. Talk about value. Security control will always be present in any format. We saw Pete pilot it and become the world champion of 2023. This deck should not ever be underestimated. And as far as matchups go, Melga just unfortunately struggles against this particular matchup. In the realm of competitive play, who you match up against can already be what decides how you'll place. Because if the match is almost always in your favor, all that's left is to keep calm and not make misplays. But of course, that's easier said than done. Beamon and D Brigade would bring up the next two archetypes with their representation each being played by 10 players. And what's not to love about either deck? D Brigade basically did what Numemon did for a while, with its floating bodies and generating new ones with BT4 Commandramon, while Beelzemon offers alternative win strategies by milling yourself out. One Beelzemon deck would make its way into the top 16, leaving only a few more openings at the top. With yet another surprise, 9 players each decided to bring Leomon and Force Sovereign. Both have a lot of potential in the current format, and though I wrote Force Sovereign off as a meme deck, it can do a lot of work with the ace top end. Only downside in my mind with Leomon again stems from the fact that Fortitude can trigger Biting Crush, and Red Hybrid can shut down play elements with Crimson Blaze. Shine Greymon, Bloom Lordmon, and Machinedramon would be the trio of decks each represented by 8 players. But again, not seeing any of these decks in the top 16 could be attributed to certain matchups. In my mind, Shine Greymon can digivolve up the chain very easily, but the biggest problem comes with hitting that Biting Crush or 7th Lightning insecurity that completely messes up your play. Bloom Lordmon feels free in Leviamon matchups because they play Digimon by card effects. And the speed of Machinedramon has not been completely solved yet. Needless to say, all of these decks are fun, and if you top with these decks, you definitely deserve some clout. Greymon, Blue Flare, and Omni Zoo would each be represented by 6 players. Now again, keep in mind, Greymon largely represents Black War Greymon, Toolbox, and OTK. And one player would nab one of the final spots in top 16 to show that War Greymon is not ready to roll over despite being hit with restrictions and lacking in speed. Blue Flare I feel shines more when your opponent plays wider boards, which is why if Anubis were unrestricted, it'd be a very different dynamic. And finally, Omni Zoo is the representative of the Apocalypse Dark Masters deck that are now utilizing Omnimons as their top end for additional value. I think while interesting, there's no optimized recipe yet. Gallantmon, Ulforce, and Royal Knights would each have 5 representatives for their decks. And surprisingly, I think they all have decent matchups in the current meta. With Gallantmon, this matchup is very good going to Numemon, which is very popular right now. Ulforce also has a decent matchup with bouncing bodies instead of deleting them, negating that float factor. But with Royal Knights, this deck felt a bit more concerning to me considering at times you may pass a lot of memory over. Meaning if your opponent is able to delete or remove your Royal Knights, it doesn't get tucked under King Drassel. For these last stragglers, Rosemon, Gammamon, Mastamon Vaccine, Grace Novamon, Amphimon, Insectoid, and Dark Knightmon each had between 2 and 4 people playing their deck. We saw a few Masta Vaccine lists actually on stream, which showcased what it could do along with Rosemon, but with Grace Novamon, Amphimon, Insectoid, and Dark Knightmon, these archetypes feel like they're still missing something. Amphimon I feel really needs Bukamon to succeed, while Grace Novamon is just missing some pieces to really go off. But for the remainder of this video, the other category definitely deserves a shout out to all the players who took these one-off decks to regionals. Beelstarmon, though savagely restricted in many ways, is still a deck that has a lot of tweaking that could be done. Millith Loop taking 2nd place overall in the tournament with careful combos. Alpha Dorbic combining the likes of new Ryudomon support with the original Alphamon support with a top-end Ragnalordmon play. Leopardmon X, despite the consequences of the Leviamon roaming around, still was being played and tested with. Black Blocker saw a resurgence using Craniumon for its all turns effect where blockers can't be deleted by card effects. a fresh take on Venom Myotismon with revival plays, utilizing Lord Nightmon and attempting the new Nightmon with older support for DP reduction shenanigans, Alphamon for its former OTK glory, Bagra Army, a Digicross deck that was largely ignored but has seen some successes throughout tournaments in recent months, Raidenmon and incorporating some of the new Machine and Cyborg support with Marvin Jackson, a whole new way to play Anubismon utilizing old Anubis and Titamon for extra Shaman targets, respectively Agumon and Gabumon decks that utilize Ukumon for more aggressive plays, and while Armor was predominantly Magnamon X, one Armor deck was purely Armor Rush, so this one gets a special shout out in the other category. Dorbrickmon still doing major card draws before plopping itself down on the field for major security checks, Mervamon going back to its old roots with Minervamon, one Hunter deck for all the tucking shenanigans it can do with the Rescuermon Superior mode, Gacha Green for the maximum RNG experience, Omnimon Alter S because ping-ponging Digivolution is fun, and last but not least, Marcus Hybrid would take the last slot in the top 16, taking elements of Hybrid and Shine Greymon and for the most part, merging them into a cohesive strategy. Watching this in play was very fun, up until the security checks into Crimson Blaze and Hades Force changed the tide of the game completely. But to close off on this video, Leviamon definitely has advantages when it comes to a lot of the current meta decks. OTK reliant decks like Mirage and Melga lack in the necessary protection of going into option cards like Bite and Crush. But remember, just because a deck is heavily played in one meta, doesn't mean that you'll necessarily play it. Check out Henny Hayes matchups in EU's first regional. Not a single Leviamon matchup. For the BT15 and Starter Deck 17 meta, I definitely feel that the strongest decks at this time are going to be Leviamon X, Red Hybrid, and Numamon. These decks showed the most consistency out of every deck from just a small sample of data, and as more events are held, I'll add more to it and give you a better perspective. But generally, it's looking like a very diverse and healthy meta. What deck will you be playing for the upcoming regional, Ultimate Cup, or is the sauce a secret? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for tuning in to this special video. This is DIGI-PANDA, logging out.